Alright guys, how's it going? Tech presentations often underwhelm, and one of the main reasons for that is that we are really ultra enthusiasts from the hardware perspective. We have a certain set of requirements that is uninteresting to the average consumer, which means we often have to suffer 90% waffle and 10% interesting content when listening to our leaders. Lisa Su's CES keynote was one of those events where 10% content was practically all we were ever likely to get. And on that front, she didn't disappoint. From what I've read elsewhere though, it was apparently pretty impressive for those of us who are maybe a little bit more normie. There's clearly a lot to get through though, and my main video script was 25 minutes long before I realised what I really had to do right now. There is a day of reckoning coming for some in the tech press, but that day isn't today. And on that topic, yes, Navi was a no-show, and I do know what happened. I will, however, talk about that in a later video. But today is all about what Lisa did show to us ultra enthusiasts. And clarifying what we got will be extremely satisfying indeed. So let's just start with the Ryzen 3000 series demo, skipping the demo of Forza and going straight to the part that mattered.
I know you guys well. I know the enthusiast community. And you're asking yourself, how does Ryzen really perform compared to the competition? So let's take one more look, just one more look. What we're going to show you today is now 3rd Gen Ryzen with a head-to-head comparison against the top-of-the-line Core i9 9900K running the industry standard Cinebench benchmark. We're running 8-core, 16-thread Ryzen, not final frequency, early sample, stock frequencies of the Intel part.
Okay, so first of all, I speculated in this recent video that due to CES keynotes being exceedingly rare events, especially for AMD, who had their first in their 50-year history in fact, that made me speculate that AMD would want to show their very best performance with Ryzen 3000, which for me must mean a 16-core demonstration. Instead though, as we heard, we only got an 8-core, 16-thread Ryzen early sample, not final frequency, up against the 9900K running at stock. Now obviously I predicted this would happen, except 16 cores and not 8. So I was of course very disappointed to hear this, but let's get on with the actual demonstration. Intel on the left, the new Ryzen 3rd generation chip on the right.
So Cinebench is going to run for a little while. What you're also seeing, just so you know, are the powers. These are the system powers that you see from each. And as I said, the image on the left is the competing processor. The image on the right is Ryzen. And what you can see, let's take a look at the Cinebench scores. Ryzen looks like 2057. Our competitor is running at 2040. So that sounds like a win. Does it sound like a win?
So Ryzen scores 2057, Cinebench are 15 points, the 9900K scores 2040. A win of only 1% for the new AMD part. That's pretty disappointing performance for 7nm. But of course, performance is only half the story here. But let's go back to the beginning of the demo and I'll talk you through what's going on. When the demo starts, we just see Cinebench side by side, and also the Windows CPU graph showing CPU load. Looking closely at the graphs, we see that, as you might expect, when Cinebench starts, both CPUs instantly jump to 100% load. This is expected behaviour because Cinebench loads every core, every thread it can use, which is one reason why it's such a popular benchmark. After about a second, we see power numbers smack in the middle of each screen. But these aren't live numbers, and we know that because the numbers we see on the screen do not actually reflect what is happening on the screen. Watch how they start off at 118.3 and 116.3 watts respectively before dropping to 46.3 and 66.9 watts, staying there for a few seconds. Then the wattages of both systems jump dramatically to around 179 and 133 watts respectively, and stay there for the duration of the benchmark. Why are both systems exhibiting this kind of behaviour? Well, luckily I have a 2700X, and a watt meter for measuring system power. So I dug that out last night and this is what I got. My PC idles on the desktop at around 83 watts. It's quite a powerful system. I've got two 1080 Ti's and my microphone, an external hard drive and a bunch of other peripherals in there. So idle power is pretty high. When I load up Cinebench, power instantly jumps up to as high as 150 watts before dropping down again to around 130 watts or so, holding there for a few seconds, then dropping back down to 83 watts, which is the same as my idle power. The reason the power jumped from 83 watts up to 150 watts, of course, was because the CPU, the memory, and the solid-state drive was activated in order to load up Cinebench. After all that process was done, power started to drop again, back down to idle, because the system had finished performing that task. What we're seeing for the power numbers in this demo right at the beginning is the end part of that process. The recording of the power numbers started right at the end of the loading process when the system power had dropped down to 118.3 watts and 116.3 watts respectively just before they both went into idle again. So we know the next numbers we see are both systems at idle, and we know this because the numbers sit there for a few seconds before the benchmark starts. The power numbers you see on screen aren't the actual figures for this run. They are figures that have been done previously and then superimposed on the screen. Or alternatively, they could be getting run at the same time as the demo, but with a slight delay in order to superimpose it on the screen. Either of those two could be true, but what we're seeing on the screen does not match the power numbers identically. But that doesn't matter. What matters is the actual numbers themselves. The Intel system idles at 46.3 watts and the Ryzen system idles at 67 watts. During the run and at the end, Cinebench holds power very stable by the way. We see 179.9 and 133.4 watts respectively. This is the power of the entire systems, not the CPU alone. So in order for us to get an idea of how much power the CPU uses, we need to use a couple of variables. But first of all, I ran Cinebench on my own system and noted the values there. Here's the whole results table. Let's start by the most important part, the delta between idle power and load power. For the i9, that is 133.6 watts. For the 3rd generation Ryzen demo, it's 66.4 watts. And for my 2700X, it's 136 watts. So instantly we can see that the 3rd generation Ryzen chip is in a completely different power class, with a power delta less than half of the other two CPUs. Now, there's a couple of things to go over here. The idle power of the 3rd generation Ryzen system is pretty high in comparison to the i9 system. This can be for various reasons, but most likely due to it being an engineering sample, so it may simply lack proper power management, which means it idles at higher watts. If we go over to Tom's Hardware and their 9900K review, we can see that the CPU package power consumption at idle for all of these modern CPUs, it's around about 12-13 watts. There's the 2700X, there's the 9900K. So let's say around about the 13 watts level for both, and a number around that 13 watts would normally be the case for this same 3rd generation Ryzen chip. However, in this instance, because it's an engineering sample being shown, that probably means it is idling closer to 34 watts. This is why there is such a difference in the idle power between the Intel i9 and the Ryzen engineering sample. The only real safe option here is to assume that that is the case. So let us actually remove 20.7 watts, that's the difference between the i9 and Ryzen idle power, from the idle power of the Ryzen engineering sample system, or what that really means is we need to increase the delta by 20.7 watts on the Ryzen chip. So we now have an actual idle to load delta of 87.1 watts, which is still way below the other two chips. But 87.1 watts is pretty close to 95 watts TDP. So what we're looking at must be a 95 watt TDP chip, right? Wrong. If so, this 95 watt i9 would be 135 watts, and so would this 105 watt 2700X. And also remember that these numbers here that you're looking at, these are taken before inefficiencies like, for example, on your motherboard VRMs and your power supply. So you would actually knock about 20% off these numbers anyway. So what says 87 watts is more like 68 watts or thereabouts. And we can clearly see that we're looking at a Ryzen 3000 chip that is in a completely different, a lower TDP class of product. The difference in the delta, even assuming worst case of 34 watts idle for the engineering sample chip, is still a massive nearly 50 watts of difference. If this i9 is a 95 watt TDP chip and this 2700X is a 105 watts TDP chip, the engineering sample that AMD showed beating the i9 9900K must be at worst a 65 watt TDP chip. Over the next day, more information came to light, including what we believe to be an idea of the clock speeds of this part. Computer Base claimed that, according to unconfirmed reports on the ground, the AMD chip worked at around 4.6 GHz, although it was unclear how many of the 8 cores were running at that turbo clock. Possibly an even better leak came from someone on AMD's Ryzen Enthusiasts closed Facebook page, who apparently claimed it was a Ryzen 5 8-core, 16-thread, 65-watt TDP chip running at 3.7 GHz base clock and hitting 4.5 GHz. I cannot verify this information, but it seems unlikely not to be legit. A few things here. You remember that engineering sample that AppySac leaked and I talked about a couple of weeks ago? 8 cores, 65 watts, 3.7 GHz base. And of course, with those numbers, I speculated 4.5 GHz boost clock. I wouldn't be surprised if it's the exact same chip because AppySac saw it running 3D Mark, and AMD will be testing the chips out on that. The second thing again is that this is actually 100 MHz faster on both the base and the boost clock as my leaked Ryzen 5 3600. Again, as we get closer to launch, clock speeds can increase or decrease slightly. Those are simply marketing and money decisions, basically. Lastly on this, just because the boost is 4.5 GHz doesn't mean it will always run at 4.5 GHz. So trying to get IPC out of this is still going to be something of a crapshoot. On average, the chip may actually have been running closer to 4.2 GHz, for example. But let me just stop myself for a minute. AMD's slowest engineering sample Ryzen 5 just beat Intel's 9900K at roughly half the power. Do you understand what this means? Yes, you do. It shouldn't be a surprise to you because we already know that EPYC is twice the performance per watt as Xeon. So why on earth wouldn't the same ring true on the desktop? But Jim, you said 12 cores and 16 cores were coming and all we got is some lame low power 8 core that's barely 15% faster than my current 2700X. Yes, sadly, that is what AMD chose to demonstrate. A point which was keenly pointed out by Flanker on Twitter, who, after previously labelling me as embarrassing on his forum, then proceeded to celebrate with, yeah, 8 cores, 16 threads, a little better performance than the 9900K, much better power consumption, launch in the middle of 2018, as Lisa said. AdoredTV told not true to the people. Celebrating just a little too early, Flanker, because what AMD chose to show was not their best hand, but their low mid-range. Something that in your haste to dance on my early grave, you embarrassingly missed, even though it was right in front of your face. I'll point out the glaringly obvious thing that you missed on your own tweet. Yes, that. On the left we have an I/O die of unknown origin. It could be TSMC or it could be GlobalFoundries, either 14nm GlobalFoundries or 16-12nm TSMC. Next to it, on the right, the smaller chip, is the Zen 2 chiplet. The same Zen 2 chiplet that I speculated would be used in everything from servers to desktops to laptops to perhaps even the game consoles. That is the same chiplet we saw with EPYC. But the important part is the part you can't see. Why on earth would AMD set up a couple of chiplets like that with the CPU off center? Well, that one is obvious. It's because there's supposed to be another chip below. When Lisa showed the package on the presentation, however, some eagle-eyed viewers caught a glimpse of something else glinting on the package. An hour or two later, some much better images came through showing clear traces on the package. Traces which look an awful lot like a Zen CCX, but this time with 8 cores instead of 4. By this point, the information started coming fast. First up was PC World's Mark Hackman, who said, Lisa Su tells us don't count on 3rd generation Ryzen to be limited to 8 cores. That extra room will be used. That was then followed by Anantech's Ian Cuttress, who asked her, more than 8 cores? With the response being, there is some extra room on that package. You might expect us to put more on that package. And in Mark's later interview over at PC World, Lisa Su said this, if you look at the evolution of Ryzen, we've always had an advantage in core count. And so, in this particular case, we wanted to show sort of a head-to-head comparison. 8 cores, 16 threads. Some people may have noticed on the package that there's some extra room. So, there is some extra room on that package, and I think you might expect that we will have more than 8 cores. I didn't say how many more. Now, you have 2 options more than 8, 12 and 16. We will see both. Now, let me end the final part of this shorter than usual video by spelling it all out clearly. AMD's 65-watt chip beats the i9 9900K in Cinebench, which is only actually very slightly favourable to AMD. Later on we got a rundown of the specs on the demo. This is over at AMD.com. And we see testing performed at the CES keynote. We see the difference in scores, 2057 versus 2040. And in fact, we see an even larger gap in the wall system power than was actually shown at the demo. The AMD system stayed the same at 134 watts, but now they're saying 191 watts for the Intel system, which is actually 30% lower. But what was interesting about this was the memory speeds used. They've used stock memory speeds, 2666 MHz memory for both systems. Also used was a Noctua NHD15S. So the Intel i9 9900K was basically running at its stock configuration and scored the same as it scored in other reviews. So there was no hobbling of the Intel system or anything like that. But the interesting point for me was, on AMD's reference motherboard, which again maybe even explained the high idle power, they also ran DDR4 2666 MHz memory. Now at the keynote, Lisa said the I/O die was desktop optimized. I would speculate that we may even see memory speeds, stock memory speeds, approaching 4 GHz, at least on the higher end parts. That's just pure speculation though. But effectively what it means is AMD's mid-range 65-watt chip beats the 9900K in Cinebench, with AMD likely hiding its true performance further by using crippled memory speeds. Now again, we don't know for sure, but my leak suggests that 8 core chips would actually be 2 4-core chiplets. There is no denying that my leak, and in fact all of my leakers, helped me to ditch my extremely accurate speculation that there would be an I/O die and 2 chiplets. That happens. Even people who have great information don't always get or give great information. That's just part of the leaker game. Had I stuck with my speculation, I'd be looking like a genius today, because that is what made most sense. The reuse of that same tiny Zen 2 chiplet, which I speculated heavily about in my evolving master plan video. But really, that stuff just doesn't matter. What matters is 8 cores, 3.7 GHz base clock, 4.5 GHz boost clock. Like I said, that is faster than my leaked specs by 100 MHz on both. I didn't choose to run with this leaked information because I believed it 100%. I chose to run with this because, and I literally said this at the start of my leaked video, it looks awfully like what my speculation would have ended up as anyway. You see, the analysis was so blindingly obvious. If you have 8 cores at 65 watts, 12 cores at 105 watts isn't much of a stretch, and neither is 16 cores at 125 or 135 watts. AMD released a slide saying that efficient 7nm means the same TDPs, coolers, PSUs, cases. Do you think they were talking about 8 cores with that statement? Of course not. They're telling you flat that even though there are more cores, TDP stay the same because of 7nm. And when the X570 motherboards come out in the summer, we can reasonably expect a lifting of the TDP limit above 125 watts in order to accommodate faster chips. Will they call it AM4 Plus? Well, I mean, they've done something like that in the past before, yeah? We had AM2 Plus and we had AM3 Plus, precisely for that reason. But let me just repeat it again. AMD just showed their slowest mid-range memory speed hobbled Ryzen 5, at least we hope they call it Ryzen 5, beating Intel's fastest desktop CPU at half the power, scoring over 2000 Cinebench points. I said it months ago and I'll say it again. When some of the rest of the tech press believed AMD would only be 25% faster because of this slide, I'll repeat my speculation. AMD's fastest Ryzen 3000 series AM4 chip will be 16 cores at high clocks and twice as fast as the 9900K. With such a difference in analysis, only one of us can be anywhere near right, and over the coming months, it will be clear who was. I'll catch you later, guys.